OSHA lecture series, as far as I can tell, goes back to the beginning of the program, 2003. I found references to the OSHA lecture series. It's a series of lectures giving at one point we had 4 locations. This was before my time. Here on the campus, the Carson Community Center, Manhattan Beach Community Center, and the Torrance Levi Adult Center. We would always do 5 lectures, and they would be from faculty, or I like to call professors, on campus. And they would talk about either their research or something of their interest, and usually something, hot topics of the day. So every fall and spring, we offer this OSHA lecture series. And today is one of our campus faculty is gonna be talking to you. But we really need you to register, and we need to bring up the numbers. It is very difficult for us to get this room and the other rooms at the Levi Adult Center and schedule and coordinate those efforts. If our membership is not interested, then we would have to cut back on the OSHA lectures. But it's a great program, which has been around for years. I mean, so many great lectures that I've attended since I've been here, including Ms. Turner. She's currently a part-time lecturer in the psychology department at California State University, Dominguez Hills. She has taught group dynamics and advanced statistics. She loves stats. We're not going to do that what I did yesterday. She received her BA in 2010 and MA in 2016 from California State University, Dominguez Hills. So she's double alumni. During that time, she has worked on numerous scientific projects, presentations, and co-taught courses with her mentor. She is currently working on her doctorate in clinical psychology at Alliant International University with about 1 year remaining. Monique has gained research and clinical training during her studies and is currently interested in social justice, the stereotype threat, self-empowerment, and positive psychology. She is currently working with her underserved populations of all backgrounds. Please welcome Monique.
So today my topic is going to be, cognition and emotions. And from experience, it's very important to kind of differentiate between our thoughts and our emotions, because they can sometimes be clouded together, which can lead to misinterpretation, biased thoughts, or misconception. So, and it's very important in older adults that we continuously kind of be mindful of how cognition and emotions can have an influence on our external behaviors. So I'll start there. And I'm going to use my clicker today. So some of the learning objectives, I'm going to briefly kind of go over the connection between the brain related to internal and external factors, and kind of discuss the brain and body relationship. I'm going to define emotion, also kind of discuss how different emotions are manipulated and how they can get activated with external stimulus, and how we have an internal process to everything that we come in contact with in the environment. And then also briefly touch on the history of emotional learning, and sometimes we learn through our experiences, kind of going back to Pavlov's classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning. And then kind of talk about how emotions are related to memory and how emotions can enhance memory, but how it can also lead to a decline in memory if we've had a stressful event. And then kind of conclude with how emotion plays a role in intention and perception. So some of the questions that I kind of want you guys to keep in mind throughout the presentation is, one, how does emotion alter our ability to remember? So as we get older, some of those cognitive abilities start to decline, but it's different things that we can do to preserve our memory. And one of those things is coming to different lectures and classes like this to keep your mind engaged in what is going on today. So that's one of the steps. But throughout the presentation, hopefully you find other ways that you can kind of increase your memory. Also, the other question is, how does emotion change our intention and our perception? So that kind of goes back to that internal and external processes and how we kind of develop our understanding through that way. So I want to start off with mental representation. So mental representation, it consists of our memory. So everything that we have previously experienced, that we've learned as we were growing up, as a child, as a young adult, as a middle-aged adult, all of those different memories that we have accumulated are called mental representations, and they're stored in our brain as long-term memory. So there's two different type of facets when we are receiving information from the external environment. And an external stimulus is anything that we see outside of us. Everything that's internal is inside of us. So when we are looking at external stimulus, we first look at the format. We describe how it looks, the shape, the size, the orientation, maybe even how it feels. That's how the brain processes the information first. Then we add the content to it. So we add some type of meaning to the information that we're seeing. So if we see this chair, we say this chair is a part of the OSHA lecture series, and we have some type of meaning with the chair. So that's the difference between the format, which is the actual chair, and then the content is the meaning that we as individuals place onto different stimulus. So that's very important, because that is how we process our information daily in milliseconds. And often these processes, these mental representations, are developed automatically, that we are not cognizantly aware that it's occurring. So within the mental representations, we have the processing system. So our brain has 4 different lobes, and depending on the type of information that we are receiving or we're trying to understand, it's processing in some way. And within that system, there's multiple processes that lead to a external behavior or external verbal communication that is all derived from our brain. So everything that exists in an external environment is related to some process in the brain. And then the algorithm is a step-by-step procedure of how we learn. So we all have a procedure of how we got here today, the road that we took, the directions that we have when we got here. That is our step-by-step procedure. So that is an example of how we intake information, how we learn something, what we read. It's all through a step-by-step procedure. And sometimes in those steps, they are so automatic that we don't realize what information we're taking in, if it's good or if it's bad or if it's healthy or it might not be so healthy. So what this lecture is kind trying to speak of is allowing us to slow down so that we can be more mindful, which is another word for being aware and conscious of how our emotions that are derived from our subjective being, how that relates to our objective mind, and being able to differentiate if we're having an emotional experience or is this a thought. So I just want to kind of show the structure of a nervous system. Pretty sure most are familiar with this. But within the nervous system, you have the central and you have the peripheral. Okay, the central is composed of the spinal cord in the brain, right here. And then we have the peripheral, which is broken up into the autonomic and the somatic, 2 different types. And then out of the autonomic system, we have the sympathetic, and then we have the parasympathetic system. So the focus of this PowerPoint or this presentation is going to be on this sympathetic nervous system, because when we're activating our emotions or we have an emotional experience that is evoked from us, then it's activated in our nervous system and it energizes us. So emotions are good. They're good to have. Like when we have joy or we're happy, we feel good, and that's a good feeling. But sometimes when we feel bad emotions or not so healthy emotions such as sadness or fear or aggression, we might get too activated. And then we have to kind of access this parasympathetic nervous system to calm us down. So the goal is to have a balance between both of these. So we want to be right in between there, in which we have a balance of being activated and we have a balance of like calming ourselves down, especially when we are having intense emotional experiences. So this is the human brain. So this is the frontal lobe, which is located right here in the front, and this is the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe is down here, which is also on both sides of your brain, and then we have the occipital lobe, which is toward the back of your brain. And just like a brief introduction to the different areas of the brain, we have the frontal lobe, which is primarily responsible for cognition, being able to control your impulsive behaviors, decision making, being able to make rational or irrational decisions, being able to execute different functions. So executive function is very, very important, and it refers to our ability to experience the present moment and to take that experience to update our previously learned information. So whatever we've learned previously from today is stored in our brain in some type of way. And sometimes that information might not be completely accurate, or it might be biased based on the different cultural influences we had in our life. So we want to be mindful that we can always update our executive functioning and our ability so that we can improve our behavior the next day. So that's in the frontal lobe. And then we have the parietal lobe, which is primarily the senses. So any sense of pain, pressure, touch. It's also related to movement, visual orientation, and also being able to perceive and to recognize different objects within the external environment. And then we have the temporal lobe, which is primarily for auditory sounds. Whatever you hear, that is typically the activation of the temporal lobe, but it also processes new information. So it's the avenue to the different information being displaced within these different lobes of the brain. And then we have the occipital lobe, which is primarily for visual processing information. But as you see, there's overlap, right? Even within, you see parietal lobe and the occipital lobe, they both have a little bit of visual in it. So in anything that we are doing, or any information that we are trying to perceive and retain for our long-term memory, we're accessing or we're activating multiple areas of the brain. So the connection. So within all of the brain processes, the frontal lobe, that's the underlying mechanisms. That's just the format. We all have a brain, and it's formatted in 4 different lobes. But the difference between all of us is that we apply cognitive appraisal to different events that occur in our lives. So that will go back to that concept that I talked about the semantic meaning. That we add some type of interpretation or knowledge about our experience. And cognitive appraisal is very crucial to understand because it can be convoluted with our emotions. We appraise something due to how we're feeling, or due to what mood we're in, or due to maybe what somebody said to us. Then we'll have our interpretation based on that situation or whatever triggered us. So it's very important to kind of differentiate when you are having a thought and when you're having an emotion, which I will reiterate throughout the whole PowerPoint presentation, because it brings us to be mindful of our present moment and to be mindful of the different processes that we're having in our brain right now as we sit here listening to this presentation. A lot of thoughts are going through our minds right now, and for us to be present, it takes a controlled process to pay attention and not be in tune with the different thoughts that you're having. And that's just like one example of how you can kind of practice that differentiation. So the main area of the brain that is activated when you have an emotional experience is the amygdala. And the amygdala is right here. And it's at the end of the basal ganglia. This is the basal ganglia. And basically the basal ganglia is responsible for routine or habits. So basic automatic behaviors that you do every day, like get up, brush your teeth, maybe have a cup of tea, cup of coffee, go take a walk, go to work, go back home, go volunteer, go back home. That is the daily routine. And that area of the brain, the basal ganglia, is activated. And it's right, the amygdala is right at the tip of that. So that kind of states, and you could kind of see that whenever we have an emotional experience that is evoked from within us, we have an automatic behavior that's attached to it right away. So when we see something that makes us sad, we automatically have a response that we're going to perform in the same way that we've performed before from sadness. But what this is also telling us is that we can remodel and reframe how we respond to different events that are stressful, or maybe going to the doctor, or remembering to take your medications and getting frustrated with that. We can remember that we are in control of how we feel and what we're doing in our life, so that the things that seem stressful, they don't have to be that stressful, because we have the control internally to control everything in an external environment. So defining emotions, in the literature there is no definite definition of what an emotion is, or what a mood is, or what a feeling is. It's subjective to the individual. If I was to ask you all what an emotion is or a feeling, what would you guys say? What would be the difference? Is there a difference between emotion or feeling, or are they the same? What are your thoughts?
Good question.
Good question. Okay, so yeah, so it is a great question. And even in scientists and researchers and cognitive psychologists, they do not have a definite definition of what emotion, mood, or feeling is. But they are able to identify characteristics that will help us understand what an emotion is, what a mood is, and what a feeling is. And I'm going to kind of go into the definition of emotion and mood. And feeling is a little bit more fleeting. That's kind of evoked from our previous experiences, is the way that I see it. Emotion is something that is kind of a synchronized. So I'm going to read you the definition. So it's a brief episode of synchronized responses. So we have some type of response in our body, rather it be bodily responses, facial expressions, or the subjective evaluation, which is another term for cognitive appraisal. So however we perceive, or however we have a change in our body, that is indicative of some type of emotional experience that is occurring for you. And it indicates that some type of event externally or even internally is being activated with you. So if we've had like the emotion of surprise, typically we see something that we were not really expecting, and then we have the emotion of surprise and we're like, oh, I didn't expect that. That is being activated through an external stimulus, but it's an internal process. And that's the same thing that's how emotions kind of work. For mood, it's a little bit more clear in the literature, because the mood refers to the duration. So people are more likely to understand a mood because they know when they're in a bad mood versus when they're not in a good mood. They're able to say like, well, I was in a bad mood for the last couple of days, this happened. So they're able to kind of pinpoint it because of the time, the frequency. But emotions and feelings are a little bit more subjective, so it's harder to kind of define those variables. But for the definition, it refers to the diffuse affective state. So state is very important, that word, that is most pronounced as a change in subjective feeling. So you see how they use feeling within the definition of mood. The state, we can be in a healthy state, or we could be in a not so healthy state. We could be in a happy state, or we could be in a not so happy state. The state that we're in, depending on the time, refers to the mood. So I think it's important that we kind of discuss the differences between these different constructs, because it helps us to understand that the experiences we have can be different depending on how we evaluate them. And then the other thing with mood is that it can be a low intensity or it can be a high intensity, depending on perhaps the emotion or the feeling that you're having at that time.
I have a question.
Yes.
That last definition, I wondered why they didn't bring in health. If you're not feeling well,
Right.
or you're in pain,
Yeah.
that affects your mood.
Yeah, good. So I'm glad that you brought that up, and coming toward the end of the PowerPoint, I kind of talk about health, and it's kind of related to what we think about ourselves as well. If we're in a not feeling well, or we perceive ourselves to have pain, that is the perception of what we're doing. And we might actually feel the pain in our body, but if we have the perception to kind of have like problem solving, or that we're doing these different activities in our life, the pain is not as salient as it would be if you were not in tune with your emotions. So the physical health is very important to the psychological health. It's because it relates, like anything that goes on into your body is some type of activation in the brain. So if we are more in control and more cognizant of the brain processes, we're able to kind of orchestrate and control what is going on in the body.
So when you have something like depression, how does that work into?
So depression is defined as lack of motivation, sadness, feeling hopeless or worthless, right? All of those things that I just named are internal feelings. So if we are aware that that is internal, there's different things that we can do to help ourselves, to make ourselves feel a little bit better. And that is that emotion regulation as well. And they kind of suggest that you do coping skills, you go out to volunteer, you come to lectures, you interact with your friends, you interact with different people, so that you are not at home all day feeling as if you are alone. But even if you are alone, there are things that you can do related to this PowerPoint of differentiating what an emotion is versus a thought, which is different from the situation. So just because you have a situation, that doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a stressful person. The situation is a situation. Your thought is a thought. Your emotion is emotion. So each of those domains are separate. And the cognition in our daily process of these different events, we are not aware that those things are separate because it's an automatic response. So if we bring ourselves to become aware of that process, then we're able to see that maybe it is different. Maybe I can see how this is a stressful situation, but it does not necessarily have to lead to my depression or contribute to depression. Because if you have that thought process that I'm depressed, everything else is going to follow along with that in your external environment. And kind of related to mindfulness and meditation, it helps you to kind of separate what is and what is not, because emotions can become biased for us. I don't know what happened. I don't know. So I'll just continue. So the next slide kind of talks about, we just kind of defined emotion and mood, and the next slide kind of talks about attitudes and motivation. Sometimes attitudes are viewed as the same as emotion, mood, or feeling, but they're different. Attitudes are more so your colored beliefs or your preferences or your predisposition about certain people or certain objects within the environment. So it's definitely different from emotion or mood or feeling, as well as motivation. Motivation is a propensity to perform a certain action, whether it be internal or external. An example of internal motivation would be my desire to be here. I was desired to be here, so I came here, which led to that action. The external motivation may be getting something from coming here. So that's the difference between internal and external motivation, but it's definitely related to a particular action. So those two terms are different from emotion, mood, and feeling. And it's really important that we differentiate these constructs. So basic emotions, research was done by Paul Ekman that identified the 6 main emotions. And it was anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. What are your thoughts about those 6 basic emotions? Do you guys agree? Do you think others should be on there? It's pretty accurate?
Yeah.
Pretty accurate, okay.
Covers everything.
Okay, yesterday they had mentioned that boredom should be on there. You know, sometimes people get bored. But this research was done across multiple cultures. And you notice that these were the 6 main emotions that kept coming up. So this is a consistent research study that they kind of came up with this information. And it kind of relates to these pictures. So this would be the angry face, right? So what Paul Ekman did was kind of observe facial expressions. So independent of how we explain what sadness or anger is, the facial expression is typically consistent amongst different cultures. So that's anger, disgust, fear, and then happiness, sadness, and surprise. So the circumcomplex model is a scientific method for researchers to observe definitions of subjective terms, such as emotions, moods, or feelings. And basically, this circumcomplex model has a y-axis and an x-axis that kind of cross like this, and I'll show you in a minute. But on one axis is the arousal. So the arousal refers to any bodily change that you feel. Do you feel like an increased heart rate? Do you feel sweating? Do you have thoughts that kind of are activated? The arousal in response to whatever the stimulus is. And then on the other dimension is the valence, the information or the interpretation that we apply to that certain event or stimulus, which is also known as, again, cognitive appraisal. So in different domains, we as human beings automatically interpret different situations in our life. So we have to be mindful of it because it can have an influence on if we're biased, or if we have a misperception, or if we have a miscommunication, or if we have a misconception of a different topic. So we have to be mindful of how emotions and thoughts are very closely related. So in this example, this is the circumcomplex model, and basically how it works is you have the activation, so you have activation versus deactivation, and then you have unpleasant versus pleasant. And that is the cognitive appraisal that we're applying to it, okay? And in the middle, this could be anything. It could be love, it could be passion, it could be mood, it could be feeling. So basically, all of these adjectives are utilized to interpret whatever word is in the middle. And typically how you read it is that any words or adjectives that are closer together, they're more likely to be seen together. So we have happy and contented. So those will be more likely to be seen together within one person than happiness and being upset. So if you see happiness, you're more likely not going to see a person being upset at the same moment. It's always the opposite. So whatever is closer together, you're more likely to see it. So if take, for example, the question that I received about depressed. You see depressed is associated or closely related with sadness, stressed, nervous, lethargic. So if you're more likely feeling depressed, you're going to feel these other emotions with it. So the goal of emotion regulation is to go to the middle, in which you have a balance of being unpleasant and pleasant. Because these different emotions are not necessarily always bad, but they're bad if they're too severe and they're not regulated. Yes?
Where does hatred fall in there?
Hatred could be actually right here where we can kind of depict what it means to other people.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you want to say more about that?
No, well, in the state that our country is in right now,
Yeah.
you see a lot of people with different attitudes about
Right.
other people. And I was wondering in that word hatred, because it comes up a lot in conversations and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
where would it fall? Because you look on their faces and it's like they're happy about it, they're glad about it.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering how would it work in this situation?
And the thing about research is that it's self-reported. And if we were to ask everybody in here what hatred meant, that you guys would have a different definition. Some will be honest, some wouldn't be honest. We will hope that you would be honest. But depending on like social media and what's kind of shown within the environment, the hatred would be something that we would have to define. And understanding the underlying mechanism of hatred is typically the cognitive appraisal that they have learned in response to different external stimulus, whether it be people or events or situations. Whatever happened previously in their life or whatever they were taught something in which they appraised it that way, which led to the cognitive appraisal that they have in the mental representation. So in order to address the hatred and the lack of support, the lack of community love, the lack of passion within the community, each individual must be able to differentiate emotion from thought. Because if you look at thought, you're able to see what is logical and what is not logical, what is rational and what is not rational. But when you are coming from an emotional approach, it's biased based on your own experiences and how you feel. So if a person feels hatred toward another person, that is somewhere derived from what they learned previously. And until we have people that are willing to be accountable and responsible for their actions and how they think and how they feel, then we're going to still see hatred in the world. So that's why I think it's really important that we continuously, through adolescence to young adult to middle adult to older adult, we understand the differences between cognition and emotion. And yesterday, one of the guests kind of mentioned that at the elementary schools, they have older adults that volunteer. So the children are getting access to older adults that have wisdom, that have experienced life in a different way, and they're getting that experience from older adults perception compared to what they're surrounded with their parents or with their peers. So I think that would be I hypothesize that if we are able to kind of combine the older adult with the younger population, we're able to kind of justify or kind of come to an equilibrium so that we will not have as much hatred. Hope that answered it a little bit.
Yes.
So sometimes, and this kind of goes back into this topic of hatred and lack of love, is that sometimes our emotions are evoked, and they're evoked based on different stimulus that we see. So in this study, they showed a picture of a child, and then they showed a picture of a revolver, a gun, and they observed what was the participant's response. And when they saw the child, they noticed that it was more positive affect that was elicited than when you saw the gun. So this speaks to, depending on what we see in our environment, whatever we know about that stimulus, that is going to contribute to how we feel about it. But we have to be mindful, and we have to be willing to be vulnerable to say, hey, I learned this in the past. It might not have been the best. Maybe I was biased, and I'm willing to let that thought down so that I can take this new experience and update my understanding, which goes back to the executive functioning and the frontal lobe. But a lot of people, particularly people as they get older, we become fixed in our ideas. We become fixed in our beliefs, and there's no room for change. And it's more change for younger adults and children because they don't know anything. They're learning as they go. But as we get older and older, we become more fixed in our beliefs, our attitudes, our motivation. That is all related to our previous experiences, which are those mental representations that I kind of talked about. So the purpose of this lecture is to enlighten us that we can always change how we view something. Because sometimes how we view it was based on a biased emotion that we appraised to a previous situation that mimicked this current situation, and understanding the differentiation of that. Because we can be able to regulate how we feel. We don't have to get stressed out about different situations. We don't have to treat other people in a rude way just because we're upset, or just because that person reminded of us somebody else, or reminded of us of a cousin that we had an argument with years ago. We can approach the present moment as a new being every day. And if we're able to approach that new present moment every day as if nothing happened in the past, we will have more love and peace in the world. That's just my hypothesis based on experience and the research. Back to that central nervous system that I kind of talked about, and I kind of identified the two particular areas that I was going to focus on. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And I just want you guys to pay attention to this side, which is the sympathetic branch, and which is the activation. So whenever we are having an emotional experience or some type of activation, we are in energized mode. And sometimes our pupils are dilated, sometimes our heart rate might even accelerate, or it might strengthen it, because emotions are good. Emotions are good to have. But if we have them too much and we don't balance them, and we're not able to differentiate and say, well, I was sad yesterday, but today is a different day. I'm not going to try to be sad today. I'm going to realize that yesterday I was sad, and today I might do something else different that might make me feel better. So being able to separate those different domains will help you to have more balance in your life. And that could lead to you strengthening your heart. So if you're able to realize that our emotions are directly related to our internal being, we're able to moderate our physical health and our psychological health. But we have to understand that anything that is in the external environment is emoted from the internal aspects of us. It's all on us and how we view it and how we perceive it and how we approach it. And if we are mindful of that, we can lead to longevity in our life. But if we have the perception that we're depressed, things are not going bad, I don't have enough money to do X, Y, and Z, everything is not good, then our behaviors are going to match our thought process. And that's why I want to kind of pay attention to how this can have an influence, right, on our physical health, something that you had mentioned earlier. And it can also inhibit activity. So sometimes your stomach can hurt, or you can have problems with your intestines. That is because your emotions are not regulated. They're not being regulated on a daily basis. And that is the goal, is to regulate, and you want to be in the middle. You don't want to be too high, and you don't want to be too low. You want to experience some sadness, but you don't want to be too sad that you go to depression. So sometimes when we're learning, we are not consciously aware that we're learning. We learn every day while we're just walking down the street. We automatically learn. That is how our brain processes information. And sometimes that information is utilized through primary resources or reinforcers. And typically, we don't need a motivation to kind of get up and do the things that we need to do. Sometimes we just have to do it because we know we have to do it. And we get primarily reinforced by just having a roof over our head or just being able to brush our teeth. Some things we don't get anything from. But sometimes when we are actually getting some type of monies or some type of reward, then that is subconsciously or unconsciously reinforcing our behavior and how we are. So just because we come to a certain facility, we get money every day, are you really going there for the benefit of what you're getting? Are you going there to help people, or are you going there to get the money? And that is something that we have to be mindful of, because that is an unconscious or subconscious experience that is leading to our cognitive appraisal of different events in our life, which can lead to the mental representation of previous experiences. So classical conditioning, just a little history, was related to Pavlov and related to the unconditioned stimulus, and they were paired with food, and he would salivate the dog, and then they would kind of led to a conditioned stimulus. So over time, through practice, eventually, as soon as the dog saw the food, he had a conditioned response. So it's the same thing with us humans. If we continuously interact with the environment, whatever type of environment that is, whether it be good or not so good, we are getting reinforced in some type of way. So it's very, very important that we surround ourselves around positive support systems, positive support things, facilities, and institutions that are feeding and nurturing our abilities and our strengths, and not taking our energy away. Because if we are surrounded by environments that are not so healthy, that can lead to a decline in our psychological health and a decline in our physical health. And if we are not surrounded by things that are motivating us, then that is the external environment that we are creating for ourselves. So we are in control of everything that is existing around us. And if you do not feel like you're in control of it, you can take control of it, because it is emoted through the self-development. And this kind of speaks about the reward or punishment that I kind of mentioned a few minutes ago, that sometimes we get rewarded for our behaviors. The reward might be seeing your friends, why you come to campus, why you drive 20 miles to campus. You know, I know it's kind of far, but I get the reward of socializing with other people. So that is reinforcing your behavior to continuously come. And as it was mentioned earlier, that a lot of people are not coming to the center, not kind of participating in the lectures. They don't know the reward, right? They haven't been here. So how would they know to come if they haven't experienced the reward? So they have to get down here to feel the reward. And then once they come, then they're going to continuously come and come, because they're getting some type of internal benefit. Or they might get an external benefit, but it's in the form of a reward. Rather, it's internal, external. And it's the same thing with punishment. We typically don't do things that we got punished for. Like we have a large fine or we have a ticket, right? We're always going to park in an appropriate spot where there's no parking on campus, but we still have to find somewhere to park, or so that we won't get a ticket. So that's the sense of punishment. So we are learning through reward and punishment subconsciously and unconsciously. And then, let's see. So I just want to kind of show the area of the brain again. So typically the reward circuit of the brain is within this area right here. So the nucleus accumbens is the area that's activated when we have a reward, when we get a reward. It's the same area that's activated when individuals are on substances, and they abuse it, they get that reward. This is the activation that is occurring. That is the same area that's activated when we have an emotion. Same area. So we can ultimately replace any negative or, I don't like to use the word negative, but not so healthy habit that we're existing or kind of contributing to in our life. We can replace it with a positive emotional experience. And we will have the same effect because the same area of the brain is activated from something that is not a not so healthy habit to something that is a healthy habit. And that is emotion regulation, where we're able to have a balance in between positive and not so positive. And then the other way that we learn, kind of going back to that example with the volunteers, the older adults going to the schools to volunteer, is through observation and instruction. That is the best way that a person can learn, is through actual experience and seeing other people do X, Y, and Z. So I can just imagine what the children are experiencing when they see older adults there, because they're able to share their wisdom, share different stories. And we were talking about yesterday that the children are more so focused on technology. It's grass outside, it's things to do outside, but the kids don't go outside and play. They're on their phones in the house, playing the video game, doing X, Y, and Z. But that is not the only thing that exists. It's a lot of nature and nurture out there that they have access to. But if they are not engaging in it, how will they learn? If they're not engaging in these different role models and these different observations, how are they going to learn? They're going to learn by what is taught to them. And we as human beings, we have to teach ourselves. We have to know things for ourselves, because that is where true understanding comes, through that self-development. So I think it's very important that we continuously surround ourselves around role models or different lectures that you guys like, because that is feeding you with information subconsciously. And sometimes you're aware of it, but sometimes you're not aware of it most of the time. So when we come to memory, obviously, if you have an emotional experience, you're going to automatically remember something a little bit better. Like if you had a great birthday and your children are all there and they surprise you, you're going to remember that. That's something to savor and to be happy about. But sometimes the emotion can be very stressful. And for instance, if you've had like a heart attack or a stroke and it sent you to the hospital, you have to stay in the hospital a while, away from your friends, away from volunteering, and you have to kind of readjust your life, that could be stressful and it could be depressing, right? So understanding that situation is a situation that happened to you, yes, but it's not a situation that has to take over your psychological well-being. And it's more so related to how you process it. So stress can kill us. Too much stress and not enough balance is detrimental to our psychological and physical well-being. We have to have a balance. If we do not have a balance, our longevity is short. So if we are able to perceive stress as a problem-solving situation instead of something that is overwhelming us, we're able to bounce back a little bit better. We might not bounce back in the same way that we were before we had the stroke or before we had the heart attack, but we're still able to exist in the world, to be there, to have a purpose, to do something in your own amount of time, such as meditation or mindfulness or talking with your pet or talking with your children. All of these little things that you all do every day is something that younger adults can't do, because if we're so tied up with going to work, paying the bills, taking care of the children, and we don't have the time to do that. But now you have the time to do that, to travel and to do the things that you want to do. But it all relies on how you view it, and if you want that to manifest in your life, and if you want to take control of the stress that's in your life or not. And we have that control because everything is emoted through the internal self that relates to the external being. So typically, emotions are healthy, right? But if they're too much, they become unhealthy, and we more so, instead of having a U-shaped curve, so when we do statistics, typically you're going to have a U-shaped curve. So you're going to have somebody at the mean, but somebody's going to fluctuate and it's going to go up and down like a roller coaster, a U, couple of U's. But if you have too much stress, it's going to look like this. It's going to be inverted view. So you're going to have a decline in memory. So if you have no arousal, it's still bad for your memory. But if you have a little arousal, your memory performance is pretty good. But then if you have extreme stress, it decomps again. It totally drops. So this is saying that we want to be somewhere in between here. We want to have a balance. We don't want stressful situations such as going to the doctor, finding a ride, or whatever stressors that you guys experience. We don't want that to be detrimental to your physical health or your psychological health. We want you to have a balance. Like, hey, this is stressful. Let me see what I can do to problem solve. What can I do to help myself in this moment? And that is the perception that we have to have toward different things in our life, even as younger adults through older adulthood. Okay. So then this brings us to the conclusion of how emotions are related to our attention and our perception. And that's all related to those mental representations that we have stored in the back of our brain in the long-term memory. And emotions can capture our attention and impair our performance depending on how we view it and if our emotions are regulated or not. But it can also facilitate our attention as well. So depending on if we're in a good mood, if we're pretty stable and we feel pretty good, like at least like 6 days out of the week, then that stability is going to relate to us being able to perceive different things in our life that we feel we can problem solve. But if 6 days out of the week we're more depressed, then the other things are going to feel overwhelming and we're going to feel like we can't do it. So everything comes from our perception of it. And we have to be mindful of that because that's our thoughts. Our thoughts are different from our emotions. Our emotions are good, but you have to keep them separate from your thoughts because the thoughts are your rationality and your logical thinking. And if you have emotions that kind of come over there, it can cloud it and you can lead to biases or things that you shouldn't be doing. So sometimes within the amygdala, remember that's the area, the primary area that's activated in the brain. Sometimes that process from the external environment to the internal process of the amygdala is interrupted through processing. And there's two different ways that it can get interrupted. One is through learning. So through our learning, whether it be classical, instrumental learning, through positive reinforcement, or punishment, or receiving a reward, all of those different examples that I gave of how we learn unconsciously or consciously, it can relate to an alteration of the cortical representation of emotional stimulus. So if we are perceiving something from not a so healthy place, it can dictate how we retain information. And then how we retain information, it leads to the consolidation of it as we sleep. So if we are retaining the information in a not so healthy way, then it has no chance of changing because it's going to get consolidated. So if we're more aware of our learning experiences in our environment, we can control the information that we're intaking and the information that we're not intaking. And then the other method is the modulation of perceptual processing. That sometimes within the amygdala, it receives some type of message from the visual cortex that this is significant. This is very, very significant, and I'm gonna process it that way. But if we know, well, you know, I wasn't able to make it to the doctor today, or I didn't take my medication, it's not that significant that I have to get stressed out about. If you know that, then you won't place as much significance on the external stimulus. And then your visual cortex will send a message to the amygdala that is in a healthy way, as opposed to being overwhelmed with stress. So however we perceive any situation or stimulus in the environment, that is how it's going to get coded into our brain. And this is the example of it. So this information, the amygdala is right here underneath the frontal lobe. Remember, that's the frontal lobe. This is the amygdala, and the visual cortex is in the back of the head, in the occipital lobe. So this information is occurring every day, milliseconds. Your amygdala is getting information from your visual cortex. That is anything that you see, anything that you perceive, any event that you attend. And based on how you feel about that event, that is going to be sent to the amygdala, which is then going to be sent to your long-term memory, which is in the form of mental representation. So what I'm saying is that we have to be mindful of how we're taking in information and making sure that we are approaching all external stimulus as something healthy, as something that we can deal with, that something is not overwhelming. And it may be overwhelming. I'm not saying that or negating that your experience is not overwhelming, or you don't have stress, or you don't have anxiety, or you don't have depression. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we have the choice to perceive it differently so that it won't impact our bodies. And so in summary, emotions can be stored as mental representations, and that kind of can relate to accumulation of different experiences over the years that can lead to us being fixed in our beliefs or our thoughts or even our emotional experiences. So we want to be mindful of that. Current emotional experiences can be evoked from automatic processes. So typically it's automatic. When it's not automatic, or when we have an emotion, it's a complex process. So we have to kind of activate that controlled process. We have to sit there and be mindful that this is a thought, this is an emotion. We have to put the effort to be able to do that. And it's gonna be a little challenging. It might be a little frustrating, but that's okay. What you're doing is you're tapping into your self-development. You're tapping into your mind so that you can build longevity into your life. And it's gonna take some time. It's worth it. It's worth it if you want to continue to be here and to have passion about what you're doing, to see your grandchildren, to see your children. It's worth the effort because you don't have to go anywhere to do it. It's all emotive from the self. And that's the beauty of the brain, is that we understand how the brain works, we're able to control ourselves and the external environment that we are existing in. And then emotions, in summary, influence our memory, attention, and perception. And again, as I've noted, it is very important that we differentiate our thoughts from our emotions. That's it. Any questions? No questions? Yeah.
Well, I just have something I discovered some years ago to
Okay.
share. I didn't know it in these terms. If I come across any kind of programming, whether it's music or movies, and we, as one of the ladies mentioned, we live in such a violent time, and it seems to always be murder against women. I don't look, and I don't listen to music that is not romantic. Simple as that. And because I don't want it stored, but I didn't realize today that that it becomes permanent in your mind. I don't want to recall it, so I don't let it in.
Right. Good. And it's good. It's a good way of molding your own brain. Like, we all have a choice to choose what we expose ourselves to and what we don't. And sometimes we might feel like we don't have a choice, but we still have a choice what to think about it. Even if we're not able to remove ourselves from the actual environment, we control our mind. We control what we feel. We control what we think. And being able to recognize that, then you're making a choice to have positive music and positive films. And that was kind of brought up yesterday that, when you go look on Netflix for shows, there's a lot of violence in the shows. There's no positive attributes or positive settings or positive things within the films. And it's unfortunate, but we have to put more effort toward accessing this positivity. And it's really fascinating that the brain is something that we have to put more effort to as well. We have to put more effort to emotionally regulate how we think about something or how we feel. And the benefit of it is us, is ourselves. The negative is going to be there without a doubt. The negative, you go outside right now, it's going to be something negative. But it takes more effort, responsibility, and wisdom to be positive and to have that positivity in your behavior. But what it goes down to is, do we have that choice? Are we going to make that choice to do that? And a lot of younger populations, they're not making that choice right now. And I think that's why there's a lot of hatred and a lack of love in the community, is because they have not been taught that they have a choice to do different. They have not been taught that they have the choice within them to think how they want to think. And not being around those supportive systems, or even just seeing the world, is just like, what hope do we have if you don't understand that everything is relied in the self? and how you process it in your brain. So I think that's really important.
What is your interpretation of, I don't know if it's called cognitive appraisal or whatever, but you know how some people, myself included, we get stressed out and we miss an appointment or late for an appointment, and we have to calm ourselves down, where you have another group of people who, oh well, I missed it. So is one reaction healthier than the other?
It just depends. It depends if your reaction is leading to more anxiety or if your action is leading to more negative emotions. Now, if your actions are leading to anxiety and negative emotions, it could be something that you can do to decrease that. Because at the end of the day, we have things that we have to do, right? And we know we have to do them. But we place an additional expectation on ourselves to do it. And sometimes the letting go people, they're able to accept that, you know, maybe I'm gonna be 5 minutes late, but it's not the end of the day. You're not going to be dictated by it. You're not going to be judged by it. You're not going to be evaluated by it. Things happen. And it just kind of goes back on how you feel, like your preferences, your personality. I'm the same way. I hate being late. But I've learned with children that I'm going to be late. And I have to be okay with that because that is the life that I have right now. That is what is existing right now for me. And if the higher powers are there telling me that it's okay to be late, it's okay to be late. But sometimes we get in the way of that process. And us as humans, the flesh, would like to stay and control X, Y, and Z. We need to do it this way, we need to do it that way. But it's no particular way to do it because we're all different. And there's different mechanisms, and maybe next time you can leave earlier that time, or maybe you cannot have too many events that day. We can always do something to change a negative event from happening, such as being late, but we have to perceive it that, well, maybe I can do something else different next time, and this time I didn't do so well. But we have to be able to say that instead of endorsing guilt and shame that, dang, I was late, you know, I feel bad, I hate being late. So it's the way that we are perceiving the situation, I believe. Yeah. No more questions? Okay. Thank you.